Hi everyone. So now I'm going to describe the oppositional or ignoring function. So this is what is called the first of the shadow functions by Beebe. I don't see it as being a shadow function. I don't describe it in any way as dramatic a way as that. Instead, I would simply say that this function and the other ones are going to describe the other shadow functions are neglected, right? They are not valued, they are not liked. So the way that Beebe describes all the shadow functions sort of negative way, yeah, you can talk about them in a negative way. I think that's quite right. They are negative. They are things which you do not actually like, you do not actually want in the world. But I would also say that Beebe's way of describing some of these are a bit too dramatic and also a bit sort of vague and arbitrary in terms of why one thing is a trickster, why one thing is a demon, all the rest. I wouldn't describe it in that sort of way. I think in his push to overly attribute the archetypes to these functions, he's sort of gotten a bit carried away in some of them and also lost something which is actually quite clear and reliable in identifying these functions within someone. So instead, let me talk about what I would call the ignoring function or oppositional function. So as you see here, we've been filling this in as we go along. The ignoring function, right, is number 7 in our model. So that puts it essentially the inverse to the leading function. Right, that's the point of it, is the inverse of a leading function. It's on the left side rather than the right. So that means it is a stubborn function. I would call it intransigent in its nature. Why is this? Well, first of all, we need to consider what this row is. This row is called the id block. And the id block, although both functions here have something in common, which is that they are both strong, like the ego block. This is a place of competence and capability. However, unlike the ego block, this is instead an area which is not valued, it is neglected, it is not wanted. And that means also, rather than being public, it is actually private. And that's why it's in the bottom two rather than the top two. This is a private area because this is the part which we are good at. We could do very well if we so chose to do so, but we actually keep to ourselves quite a lot because it's not something we're interested in showing to others, showing to the world. It's not something we're proud of, you could say. But as I said, it's also intransigent in its stubbornness because it's neglected, right? Because it's not valued. It's not asserted in its stubbornness. Not this is what I'm going to push onto things around me, right? The leading function and the mobilizing function, on the other hand, these are both of these, leading function, mobilizing function, these are both asserted, right? The ignoring is not asserted because it's not valued. It is instead intransigent. It's more of a, I am not doing this. I am refusing to do this in most circumstances. So that's the idea. It is an I'm not doing this sort of thing. However, it isn't an absolute, it's not always off, you could say. In some situations, it can actually be used, but it's very specific in terms of when it can be used. And that specific rule is the ignoring function or the oppositional function will only be used when the leading or dominant function requires it to be used. The rest of the time, it's essentially locked in the cage. It's like, no, I'm not coming out. I'm not doing it. I don't want to. Sorry. Nope. That's the idea. But suddenly, when the dominant function comes and says, right, you will come out and you will do this, I need you to do this, then it will come out. Now, the reason it's not out and about most of the time, it's in that cage most of the time, is because it's so contrary to what the leading function is about, dominant function. It's the inverse of it. So to use it too much is to almost be at cross purposes with what you are doing most of the time. If you are, say, an ESTP, let's say you've got extroverted sensing in a leading role, in leading function, you're going to be all about increasing the intensity of your physical surroundings. You're going to be taking up more, you're going to be very possessive, you're going to be very sort of assertive and aggressive, right? So introverted sensing is not going to be used very much because you're not going to be harmonizing the flow and the harmony of your surroundings. It's kind of the opposite to what you want to do. It's not your tempo. It's not your way of operating in that physical space, in your sensory, or an intuitive in that intellectual space, or that social interpersonal space if you're ethical, or logical space if you're logical. It's just not your way of doing it. So this is the other way of doing things to how you normally do it. And there are only a few situations when you might want to do the other approach to what you do in order to do the thing which you normally do as well as you can. That's the idea. It's there to it's brought in to fill in the cracks when the leading function needs it, and then it's going to be put back in its box later. There, to be truly strong in your leading function, and the leading function is strong by its nature, means the ability to draw upon the ignoring function in those few situations where it's actually required. Because to not be able to do so is to create failure. And that's why the leading function is not a weak function, it's a strong function, because it actually can get the ignoring function out of the cage in those few situations where it's required. If you look at other examples, let's say an ISFP, right? Type leading an introverted sensing, right? Very gentle, very harmonious in its nature, and uninclined to get into fights and arguments. But let's say a situation comes which is so uncomfortable in its surroundings that for it to actually restore balance and harmony, it actually has to get pushy and get angry and assertive and dominant. In those few moments, it will become angry and dominant and assertive in order to restore the balance and harmony in the moment. So that is an ISFP, which is SI in the dominant function, drawing upon extroverted sensing in order to satisfy introverted sensing. That's the idea of the ignoring function. You don't use it the majority of the time, hardly ever. In fact, you're best at minimizing its use. But when you do have to use it for the sake of your leading function, or dominant function, then you will. That's the idea. So should it be called an oppositional function? I don't think that's such a bad name, actually. You are kind of opposed to this thing. When it is used, it is the opposite theme to what you actually push. You are going to be intransigent against it rather than assertive in proposing it. But I would say that it's important to know what the actual rules of that is and when it actually can be used by the person. So that's the point I'm trying to make with the ignoring or oppositional, right? It's actually not the worst named one. It's not the most vaguely described one. I think it's actually close to being on the money. So I hope that helps. But yes, think about when you actually can use your ignoring function and when, for the most time, it is being suppressed by the dominant or leading function, which is what Jung also described. He also said that you suppress the inverse of your dominant function. So that's entirely in keeping as well. I hope that helps.